Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, you and I are diving deep into something incredibly common, something most of us grapple with, the psychology of overeating.
hmm
We've pulled together a really interesting mix of stuff for this: psychological studies, economic thinking, cultural observations.
Yeah.
And our goal is to understand what's really going on, beneath the surface of this complex behavior in our modern lives.
That's right. Looking at all this material, what really jumps out is just how many different angles there are to consider. It's way more than just um, individual willpower.
Right.
We're talking about everything from your own personal history with food to the bigger picture of how our society and economy are structured.
Exactly. And for you listening, our aim is to make sense of all this without making your head spin. We want those aha moments where things click
Right.
and you suddenly see why we eat the way we do within this whole context of modern consumerism.
And as we go through these sources, you'll see we're trying to connect the dots between why we might overeat on a personal level and the larger cultural and economic forces at play. It's about seeing how your individual experiences fit into a much wider system, really.
So to get us started, one of our sources shares a really relatable personal story.
Oh, yeah.
The author remembers growing up surrounded by super sweet treats and never once thinking anything was too sweet.
Wow.
It really makes you think about how those early experiences shape our taste preferences and our relationship with food right from the start.
What's fascinating there is how that simple childhood observation actually sparked a whole career in studying the psychology of food.
Right.
The author mentions that back then, it wasn't really taken seriously, almost a bit of a joke. That tells you something, doesn't it? But how recently we've started to really dig into the complex ways our minds, food, and society interact.
And it wasn't like this author was working in a vacuum. They talk about how important the Association for the Study of Food and Society was.
Mm.
And key people like Warren Belasco and Ken Albala, who were so welcoming and encouraging in those early days when this field was still, finding its feet.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even seemingly small areas of study can grow into really important ways of understanding ourselves.
Absolutely. Now, to really get a handle on why we overeat in the world we live in, we need to define some terms, I think.
Good idea.
Our sources point to the Oxford English Dictionary and its different meanings for consume, consumption, and consumerism.
Right. Originally, consume was about using something up completely, but it's grown, hasn't it, to include fulfilling our needs.
Okay, so it's not just about physically using something until it's gone, but also why we're using it in the first place. What need or desire are we trying to satisfy?
Exactly.
And traditionally, if you looked at how different experts studied consumption, whether it was food or drugs or natural resources, they pretty much stayed in their own lanes, right?
Pretty much. You'd have nutrition experts focusing on food, addiction specialists looking at drugs, ecologists concerned with using up resources, and then economists and sociologists studying the bigger picture of consumerism. What's really interesting is the rise of consumption studies
Yeah.
as a field that tries to bring all these different viewpoints together under one roof.
So what we're doing here in this deep dive, much like the book our author is writing, is trying to connect the psychology of overeating to this broader understanding of consumption.
Yeah, exactly.
It's about stepping back from just thinking about individual psychology and seeing overeating as part of this wider cultural and economic landscape that we all inhabit.
And the core idea that starts to emerge, I think, is that there might be a similar psychological drivers behind all sorts of consumption,
Okay.
whether it's food, buying things, or even using up natural resources. It's about finding the common threads, that run through our desires and how we act on them as consumers in general.
This is where it gets really interesting for you listening. Our sources highlight that so many things have come together to create this consumer culture in the West: brain chemistry, brain structure, our evolutionary history, the way our economies work, historical shifts, and cultural norms. It paints a really complex picture of how we've gotten here.
It really does.
Yeah.
And when you look at the consequences of all this overconsumption, they're pretty stark.
Yeah.
Our sources link it directly to things like waste, the greenhouse gases that are changing our climate, and of course the rise in obesity.
Right.
Using that powerful phrase, eating ourselves alive, it really hits home how interconnected these issues are.
To really make this relatable, our author introduces us to a patient named Allison.
Okay.
She's a former athlete who put on weight after getting married, went through some tough times with depression and divorce,
hmm
and comes from a well-off family with all the pressures to have a successful marriage. It's a story that probably resonates with a lot of modern experiences.
What's particularly insightful about Allison's story is how she initially tried to lose weight.
How so?
Instead of actually reducing what she was consuming, she ended up consuming more, spending thousands on diet foods, exercise gear, and various weight loss services.
Wait, really? More?
Yeah, it seems totally backwards, doesn't it?
It really does. She got a nutritionist and a personal trainer, bought all sorts of gadgets like a juicer and a fitness tracker, tons of workout clothes, a gym membership, and all these special diet foods.
Mm-hmm.
It's like she thought buying more stuff was the key to getting rid of excess weight.
And this brings up this idea of false dietary magic in branded diet foods.
Yeah.
The fancy packaging and logos create this illusion of health and weight loss, even though a lot of these products are really just, well, cleverly disguised junk food.
It's a really effective marketing trick that plays on our desires, isn't it?
Totally. Plus, there's a connection made to how shopping at those big warehouse stores actually makes us spend more overall.
Right.
It seems like this initial diet of Allison's might have even led her to eat more calories, all driven by this underlying belief that buying things is the way to solve problems.
Exactly. It's not that things like having a trainer or a juicer can't be helpful tools.
No, of course not.
The real issue is that Allison wasn't using them to change her fundamental relationship with consumption or to find deeper meaning in her life.
Right. It was all part of this bigger cultural frenzy of consumption, this constant urge to acquire.
So her attempts to fix overeating by consuming even more really highlights this confusion between the problem and the solution.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
this almost desperate search for fulfillment through buying things, whether it's food, alcohol, or those luxury items we think will somehow make us feel better.
And our source touches on this feeling of an existential vacuum that Allison experienced.
A vacuum.
Yeah, this sense that if she's not spending money or acquiring something, there's a void. She really struggles to even imagine a different way of life that's more focused on experiences and less on possessions.
It makes you think about all the conflicting messages we get, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
On one hand, we're told that eating well is about being disciplined and having willpower. But then we also hear that our genes or brain chemistry are to blame for our cravings.
It's this constant tug of war, right, between personal responsibility and biological determinism when it comes to our diets.
And what complicates this even further is how the research on overeating tends to be very segmented.
How so?
You've got doctors looking at it from a medical perspective, policymakers trying to create regulations, and psychologists focusing on individual behavior.
And they don't always talk to each other.
Exactly. What's missing is this bigger picture that takes into account all the cultural, economic, existential, and biological factors together.
So overeating isn't just about what's on our plates. It's tied into this larger trend of seeking out and consuming highly stimulating experiences that's become so common in urban Western life and is now, spreading around the globe.
And it's so important to remember that we're not just talking about people who are overweight here.
Crucial point.
The focus is on the act of overeating itself, which doesn't always lead to weight gain.
Right.
Our sources mention this idea of being metabolically obese, normal weight,
Right, MONW.
where people can have the same health problems as someone with obesity despite having a normal BMI.
That's a really key point. So people who are struggling with their weight are really just the most visible part of a much larger issue of overconsumption.
Yeah.
That affects us in all sorts of ways, whether it's with food, electronics, or anything else we tend to accumulate.
Now, to really understand the cultural backdrop here, our sources introduce the 5 ways we understand consumerism, as outlined by Gabriel and Lang.
Okay.
The first is consumerism as a moral doctrine.
A moral doctrine. Interesting.
Yeah, where making choices about what to buy and actually buying things is seen as a path to personal freedom, happiness, and a sense of power.
Okay, let's unpack that. So in this view, what we own and buy becomes really tied to who we are as individuals, even more so than the work we do.
Yeah.
Our free time becomes time for shopping, and there's this basic belief that having more stuff equals greater happiness.
Precisely. And this moral belief even promotes the idea that consuming is a way to develop yourself and find fulfillment. It becomes very psychological, where our sense of self is built around what we consume and project to the world.
And this whole idea then fuels constant economic growth, right?
Okay.
And it starts to blur the lines between what we actually need and what companies want us to want.
Exactly. It's like the market itself becomes this all-powerful force, almost like a global religion, teaching us our place in the world through our role as consumers.
The philosopher David Loy actually argues this point, suggesting that market capitalism has, in a sense, taken the place of traditional religions,
Hmm.
with this endless drive for growth becoming the central belief system.
And it's almost a contradiction, isn't it? We often use economic growth as a way to measure how happy a country is.
Yeah, GDP.
But studies actually show that while wealthier people within a country might be happier than poorer people, overall happiness levels in a country don't necessarily go up as the national income increases.
It's a crucial insight. Even though we're spending so much more money than people did in the past, people in the U.S. don't report feeling any significantly greater level of happiness.
Right.
This idea of equating a country's economic output with its well-being reinforces this cultural belief that more is always better. And
Yeah.
perhaps unsurprisingly, our waistlines have grown along with the GDP, contributing to the obesity problem.
Yeah, that connection is stark. Okay, the second understanding is consumerism as a political ideology.
Political now. Okay.
Here, the focus shifts from our individual desires to the idea that spending money is actually an act of patriotism, something that helps the entire country by boosting the economy.
Yes, think back to after 9/11, when President Bush encouraged people to go out and spend money as a way to support the nation.
Right, I remember that.
Or the economic stimulus package in 2009, which was all about getting people to spend rather than save. These kinds of messages frame our individual consumption habits as something that contributes to the greater good of the country.
It's fascinating how these two ideas, this moral belief that buying makes us happy, and this political idea that it's good for the country, really work together to create this very strong pro-consumption environment.
Absolutely. And our sources also briefly mention other ways of understanding consumerism that they'll explore more later in the book,
Right.
including seeing it as a psychological disorder, a way we connect with each other socially,
Yeah.
and just the basic logic of how businesses operate.
Right. It really shows you how many different angles there are to look at this.
For sure.
Moving into what might be a more uncomfortable area, our deep dive touches on the connection between certain personality traits like psychopathy and narcissism and our consumer culture.
Ooh, okay.
Traits often linked to psychopathy, such as being dominant and fearless, are sometimes seen as signs of American success, wealth, ambition, that kind of confident go-getter attitude.
What's interesting here is that researchers have actually found that these kinds of fearless dominance traits in U.S. presidents have sometimes been linked to better ratings in things like leadership and handling crises.
Really?
Yeah. It suggests that certain aspects of what might be considered psychopathic traits could actually be unintentionally rewarded in our society.
And then there's narcissistic personality disorder, with its characteristics like grandiosity, a lack of empathy, and a sense of entitlement. The argument is made that maybe these disorders aren't entirely separate from our culture, but rather exaggerated versions of traits that our society, to some extent, encourages.
Some researchers suggest that narcissistic and antisocial personality traits might just be extreme versions of personality traits that our culture, to some degree, values,
Right.
especially around self-promotion and focusing on individual achievements. It makes you wonder if our culture itself might have certain tendencies in that direction.
This leads us to these concepts of luxury fever and affluenza.
Right.
Luxury fever is described as this continuous increase in how much we consume luxury goods over the last few decades, regardless of things like inflation or economic downturns.
And affluenza is a term used to describe the negative consequences that come from this constant desire for more and more. Things like feeling overwhelmed, being in debt, experiencing anxiety, and creating a lot of waste. It's almost like a social condition that spreads. And it's not just affecting the very wealthy, but increasingly people in the middle class too.
It's like our sense of what's a basic need versus a luxury gets all twisted as we become more affluent.
Yeah.
Things that used to be considered luxuries start to feel like everyday necessities.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it's not just that we're consuming more calories overall, we're also eating more frequently throughout the day.
Oh, yeah.
Research suggests that people in America are often eating every hour or hour and a half,
Wow.
which could be messing with our natural signals of hunger and fullness.
And it's probably no surprise that this increase in how many calories we're eating has contributed to rising rates of overweight and obesity.
Definitely. Our sources point to research showing that foods that are high in energy, meaning they have a lot of calories and are less expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Often, those refined grains, sugars, and unhealthy fats tend to be the cheapest options.
This initially led to the understanding that poverty was a direct cause of higher obesity rates.
Right, but it's more complicated.
How so?
Well, the situation has turned out to be more complex.
Hmm.
While the severity of being overweight might be greater for people with lower incomes,
Mm-hmm.
there isn't a clear connection between the prevalence of being overweight and poverty itself.
Mm.
And in fact, the rates of obesity have even started to become more similar between high and low income groups.
It's also been observed that there are nutritious foods that are also inexpensive, but sometimes people still don't choose them.
Right, so it's not always just about what people can afford.
That's right. And when we look at the bigger picture, there's a clear trend of both increased consumerism, how much we're spending on things like luxury items,
Yeah.
and increased caloric intake, especially from things like grains and refined carbohydrates.
This brings us to this powerful idea of using the word sugar as a metaphor.
Oh, interesting.
For both those empty calories in our food and those unnecessary things we buy, they're both seen as potentially toxic
Right.
to our bodies and our minds when we overdo it without balance.
Now, let's shift our attention to how this consumer culture affects us psychologically.
Okay?
Way back, thinkers like Erich Fromm argued that the way our capitalist economy is set up actually contributes to mental health problems.
hmm And more recently, psychologists like Phil Cushman have introduced this concept of the empty self.
The empty self, what's that?
The idea here is that in Western society, we've lost a lot of the strong community ties, traditions, and shared values that used to give our lives meaning.
Okay.
And this has led to a kind of chronic, undifferentiated emotional hunger.
Wow. And this empty self then tries to fill that void by acquiring and consuming things.
Exactly. We experience these broader societal problems internally as a feeling of not being good enough or not having enough.
Right.
And we turn to buying things, taking medication, or overeating as a way to try and soothe those feelings.
Mhm. So it's like we're treating these bigger societal issues as if they're just individual problems.
Yeah,
And the cure becomes more individual consumption.
exactly. And our sources delve into some really interesting modern examples of this, like what they call consumer pornography.
And superlithography.
Yeah, which you see in things like unboxing videos, whether it's kids opening surprise eggs or adults showing off the latest gadgets. These videos create this sense of anticipation and excitement.
Oh, okay. It's like a return to a more childlike fantasy world where there's this link between excitement, new beginnings, and getting what we desire.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Even something like Andy Warhol's banana art played with this kind of anticipatory aspect of wanting and acquiring.
And the often perfect, idealized images we see in consumer culture can make us feel inadequate, which then pushes us to consume even more in an attempt to reach those unrealistic standards.
It's this never-ending cycle, isn't it, of wanting, buying, and then feeling like it's still not enough?
What's actually quite surprising, though, is that there hasn't been a huge amount of in-depth research specifically looking at the direct psychological effects
You'd think there'd be more.
that this consumer culture has on our overall well-being.
That's true. However, researchers like Tim Kasser and Richard Ryan have done important work showing that when people focus a lot on luxury and acquiring possessions,
Yeah.
it actually undermines their sense of well-being, leading to more depression and anxiety and creating these desires that can never really be satisfied.
And Kasser's research with the aspiration index suggests this is a kind of loop. Focusing on material things makes us less happy.
Right.
But feeling unhappy can also make us focus even more on material things.
It's a self-feeding cycle.
Mhm.
And what can be really harmful is that we often don't see these negative psychological effects as coming from a larger problem with our consumer-driven society.
We blame ourselves instead.
Exactly. We tend to blame ourselves, thinking it's a lack of willpower or some issue with our brain chemistry, which then leads us to seek more consumption as the answer.
This is why things like retail therapy, going shopping to feel better, and comfort food are so common.
Precisely. They're both ways we try to soothe ourselves through consumption, but ultimately they can have negative consequences in the long run.
And this tendency to overconsume goes beyond just food. Our sources discuss how having homes that are overflowing with stuff
Oh yeah, the clutter.
can actually increase our psychological stress and even raise levels of cortisol, that stress hormone, especially for mothers.
The fact that the storage industry has grown so much is a direct result of our struggle to manage all the things we accumulate.
It's almost like these storage units are physical representations of our difficulty in letting go,
Yeah.
allowing us to avoid dealing with the emotional weight of all our possessions.
And there's an interesting parallel drawn here to body fat as a kind of storage for the extra food we've overeaten.
Hmm. It's probably not a coincidence that both binge eating disorder and hoarding disorder have recently been recognized as distinct conditions in the DSM.
It seems likely. Going back to Allison,
Yeah.
her intense focus on status and money actually creates a sense of isolation for her, both romantically and socially.
How so?
She becomes, as our source puts it, a prisoner in the jail of comparison, constantly measuring herself against others and
Yeah.
always feeling like she falls short.
And how does she try to cope with these feelings?
By indulging in more luxury shopping and eating expensive foods, trying to project a certain image and find comfort in these things.
It's exactly that cycle of more affluence leading to less well-being that researchers have talked about.
To really illustrate how our culture reinforces these values, our deep dive looks at a somewhat controversial Cadillac commercial
Oh, I think I remember that one.
that very openly celebrated materialism and the idea of working long hours just to be able to afford luxury goods as the epitome of the American dream.
That commercial definitely stirred up some strong
And
opinions.
it sure did. Some people saw it as celebrating American ambition and enjoying the fruits of hard work, while others saw it as a really depressing vision of sacrificing your life just to buy expensive things.
Regardless of how you interpreted it, the commercial served as a powerful cultural statement, didn't it?
Absolutely. Reinforcing the idea that luxury and high income are the ultimate goals to strive for, especially as the U.S. was trying to recover from an economic downturn.
It's striking to think about how early we start getting these consumerist messages.
Isn't it, Jess?
The author shares a personal memory of selling things like cookies and magazine subscriptions as a kid,
Yeah.
highlighting that early introduction to the world of sales and the often underwhelming grand prizes that came with all that effort.
Now, let's bring our focus back to food and talk about this term, hyperpalatable food.
Hyperpalatable. Okay.
This is a term used in neuroscience to describe foods that are really high in refined sugars, flours, unhealthy fats, and salt.
Right.
These combinations trigger a really strong pleasure response in our brains and release a lot of dopamine.
It's important to clarify, though, right, that while ultra-processed foods are often hyperpalatable,
Yeah.
not all hyperpalatable foods are heavily processed. Think about something like bacon-wrapped dates. They can be incredibly delicious because of that combination of sweet dates and salty, fatty bacon.
Great example.
But they're made with whole ingredients.
Exactly. And as convenience foods became more popular in America, food scientists really started to understand the power of enhancing flavor and making foods more palatable. This led to a very competitive industry, sometimes called the Great Flavor Rush, where scientists are constantly trying to create the next incredibly addictive flavor combination.
While this global industrial diet has affected the nutritional quality of food for almost everyone, our sources emphasize that the negative health consequences disproportionately affect people with lower incomes.
Right. It's created a kind of two-tiered system when it comes to nutrition.
It might seem too simple to say that wealthier people can just afford healthier food.
Yeah, it's more nuanced.
But the reality is much more complex. There are issues of cultural norms around food, and there's even a debate about whether having access to the taste, convenience, and variety of the industrial food supply, like eating out, should be considered a basic part of food security.
But as we've already discussed, it's often those very characteristics of the industrial diet, the hyperpalatability, the extreme convenience, and the overwhelming number of choices
Right.
that actually contribute to us overeating.
And even when you look at people who are struggling with food insecurity, there's often a surprising picture.
Yeah.
National Geographic did a photo essay showing families who were considered food insecure but still had things like decent homes, appliances, and brand name clothing.
Wow.
It really highlights the difficult choices people face in a culture that's so focused on material wealth and how food might sometimes take a backseat to other perceived needs.
Even programs like S&P, which are meant to help people afford food, can end up supporting the consumption of less healthy options.
Really?
Kraft even opposed cuts to food stamps because so much of their revenue comes from those purchases. And the soda industry has successfully lobbied to keep sugary drinks eligible for SNAP benefits.
That's concerning.
And it's even more concerning when you look at how advertising for sugary drinks disproportionately targets Black children and teenagers who already face higher rates of poverty. This contributes to a growing gap in the quality of diets between different socioeconomic groups.
To really illustrate the impact of this global industrial diet, our source shares a really striking story about a refugee family from Burma
Oh, yeah.
who had never been exposed to it. Their horrified reaction to their first taste of hot chocolate really shows just how much our palates have been shaped by the excessive sweetness in the food supply we've become accustomed to.
Wow, that's powerful. We also have the example of Chloe, a 19-year-old who very quickly maxed out a high-interest credit card.
Okay.
This shows a lack of understanding about how credit works and reflects her family's cycle of living paycheck to paycheck with a lot of debt. It really highlights how deeply ingrained this cultural message of uninhibited consumption can be.
So, with these hyperpalatable foods, it seems like the food industry really benefits by selling massive amounts of them,
Mm.
while consumers end up facing the negative health consequences.
It's described as a situation where the profits are privatized by the companies, but the costs to our health and the healthcare system are shared by everyone.
People who are struggling with debt and excess weight have been bombarded with messages promoting consumption their entire lives.
Yeah, it's a constant barrage.
It takes a lot of effort and knowledge to go against those powerful cultural forces.
Absolutely. While personal responsibility is important, we can't ignore the systemic issues and regulatory failures that are at play,
Right.
and that these often disproportionately affect those who are already vulnerable.
That idea of the empty self comes up again here, doesn't it? Where our individual struggles with things like overeating or debt can actually be a reflection of bigger problems within our culture.
Exactly. These extreme cases of bankruptcy and obesity can almost be seen as outward signs of a deeper societal imbalance.
And one of the things contributing to this is a decline in how much emphasis we put on things like nutritional and financial literacy and education.
Yeah, like home acumen shop class.
The reduction in home economics and shop classes, for example, has arguably had an impact on our basic life skills and our connection to the material world around us.
Think about the anthropologist Richard Wrangham's argument about how important cooking is from an evolutionary perspective, or Claude Lévi-Strauss's view of it as a civilizing act. Ultra-processed foods really undermine this fundamental human activity of preparing our own meals.
The increasing gap between the very wealthy and everyone else has led to the creation of these concentrated areas of wealth, sometimes called super zips.
Super zips, right?
This creates a large market for luxury foods in stores like Whole Foods. It's interesting to contrast the original idea of a Whole Foods market as a place for healthy, natural foods with some of its modern flagship stores that are now selling what's described as luxury junk food at very high prices.
Luxury junk food. That's a lot. It makes you wonder about the line between being manipulated by clever marketing and just, well, deceiving ourselves so we can indulge our desires.
Yeah. While the food industry certainly uses sophisticated techniques, we as consumers also play a role, don't we?
We do. Basic nutritional knowledge doesn't require years of schooling.
When it comes to food choices, the strongest predictor is palatability, how good a food tastes to us.
Right. Initially, research in this area focused mainly on sweetness, but then shifted to understanding the powerful combination of sweetness and fat.
Okay.
This led to the term hyperpalatability to describe those manufactured foods that are high in sugar, fat, and often salt.
And then there's this concept of the bliss point.
Yes, the bliss point.
Yeah. Where food scientists work to optimize the flavors in food to hit that perfect combination that gives us the most pleasure, making the food almost irresistible.
That's the science behind that feeling of, I can't believe I ate the whole thing.
Right. We also can't ignore what's been called the hydration lie.
The hydration lie. Tell me more.
This is the beverage industry's very successful campaign to convince us that we need to be constantly drinking bottled water, juice, and sugary drinks, really downplaying the role of our natural thirst cues.
The actual science of hydration doesn't necessarily support this constant need to be pre-hydrating, does it?
Not really, no. And the food industry also cleverly manipulates how we think about energy.
How so?
They create flavor profiles in energy drinks that they know consumers expect, even if those flavors are completely artificial and have nothing to do with actually giving us more energy.
Wow. Marketing directly to mothers and children is another key strategy.
Oh, definitely.
The food industry has a long history of creating special foods just for kids and taking advantage of children's natural naivety about advertising.
This includes blurring the lines between actual TV shows and commercials and deliberately using what's called the nag factor to pressure parents.
And surprisingly, the U.S. has very few restrictions on advertising unhealthy foods to children.
It's kind of shocking, really. Let's talk a bit more about the actual chemistry of sugar.
Okay.
Our preference for sweet tastes is stronger and more widespread than for any other taste, and it can even have a temporary effect of improving our mood.
Right. From an evolutionary standpoint,
Yeah.
it makes sense. Sweetness often signaled that a food was safe to eat and a good source of energy.
And those sweet taste receptors aren't just on our tongues, we actually have them throughout our bodies.
Really? Didn't know that.
Yeah. Sugar can also have a pain-relieving effect in children and can activate the opioid system in our brains,
Ah, the opioid system.
which is the same system involved in addiction.
From a more psychological perspective, that taste for sweetness might also tap into feelings of nostalgia for childhood.
Like comfort food.
Kind of.
Yeah.
The current popularity of cupcakes and the use of retro imagery in advertising could be playing on this. Even the book and movie Charlie and the Chocolate Factory
Oh, yeah.
really capture this almost regressive power of sugar and the fantasy of escape it can represent.
Globally, the amount of sugar we consume has been on the rise since World War II.
A huge increase.
And there's now a massive global market for sweeteners. A surprisingly high percentage of the food available in the U.S. contains added sugars, and most people are eating far more than the recommended daily amount.
The health consequences of all this sugar are really significant, going way beyond just obesity.
Like what?
There's growing evidence linking high sugar intake to things like certain types of cancer and conditions related to insulin resistance, like Alzheimer's disease, fatty liver disease, PCOS, and type 2 diabetes.
Wow.
And the global healthcare costs associated with sugar consumption are staggering.
The food and beverage industry is heavily investing in trying to find new types of sweeteners and what they call sweetener technology.
Always looking for the next big thing.
However, artificial sweeteners, which are often seen as a healthier alternative, may actually lead to people consuming more calories overall
Really?
and have been linked to their own set of metabolic problems.
So not necessarily a magic bullet. Sugar is also used in a lot of processed foods and drinks to mask bitter tastes,
Right.
which can make these products even harder to give up because the unpleasant flavors are hidden.
There are some really interesting parallels between sugar and addictive drugs
How so?
in terms of how they're refined and how powerfully they trigger pleasure in our brains. Some studies in rats have even shown that sweet liquids can be more rewarding than cocaine or heroin.
More rewarding than cocaine. That's intense.
The neuroscience supports this idea, showing that diets high in fat and sugar can have similar effects on the brain's reward pathways, the opiate and dopaminergic systems, as addictive drugs. Even a drug like naltrexone, which is used to treat opioid and alcohol dependence, has shown some promise in reducing people's consumption of high-sugar, high-fat foods.
This really highlights how difficult it can be to cut back on overeating without finding other sources of comfort and pleasure in life.
Definitely. We see this in the example of Bethany, whose struggles with infertility led her to rely heavily on food as her primary source of enjoyment.
That makes sense. The debate about whether to officially recognize food addiction as a substance use disorder in the DSM is ongoing.
Right.
Research has shown addictive-like behaviors in both animals and humans in response to hyperpalatable foods. There's even evidence of what's called addiction transfer, where someone might substitute food for other addictive substances.
Interesting.
Interestingly, there's an inverse relationship seen between BMI and the use of illicit drugs, and obese individuals tend to have lower rates of other substance use, suggesting that food might be functioning as a kind of substitute.
While food addiction isn't yet listed as a substance-related disorder in the DSM-5,
No, not yet.
the manual does acknowledge that some eating-related symptoms look a lot like those seen in substance use disorders, like strong cravings and compulsive use.
Right. This suggests that there might be shared pathways in the brain, and there are many scientists who are actively calling for food addiction to be recognized as a legitimate condition.
Coming back to consumerism, you can see how these engineered, hyper-palatable foods create a vicious cycle where we need more and more to feel satisfied. They actually mask our body's natural signals of fullness and can even affect how our bodies store fat.
It really makes you wonder if the companies that make these industrial foods are operating in a way that's similar to drug dealers.
It's a provocative thought. Binge eating disorder, which involves recurrent episodes of eating large amounts of food in a short period, was recently added as a specific diagnosis in the DSM-5.
Right, BED. This was a significant change because previously, people who binged but didn't engage in compensatory behaviors like purging didn't have a specific diagnostic category.
However, with any changes to diagnostic manuals like the DSM, there are always concerns about overdiagnosis and underdiagnosis,
Type I and type 2 errors, yeah.
what statisticians call type I and type 2 errors.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of consumerism and food, there's a potential for bias towards overdiagnosis,
Why is that?
which could lead to more people being labeled with disorders and potentially consuming more products or treatments, increasing profits.
Ah, okay. There's also this risk of medicalizing normal, defining things as disorders based on experiences that are actually quite common in human life.
Like what?
The removal of the bereavement exclusion for major depressive disorder in the DSM-5 is an example of this, where normal grief might be labeled as a clinical condition.
This leads us to the idea of lifestyle drugs.
Lifestyle drugs.
Medications for non-life-threatening conditions that are heavily advertised directly to consumers.
Right, DTC advertising.
Despite questions about how effective they are compared to placebos in many cases, the pharmaceutical industry spends a lot of money promoting them, often with that familiar refrain, ask your doctor if this drug is right for you.
The creation of this market for lifestyle drugs has been a long-term goal for big pharmaceutical companies,
Expanding the market.
aiming to expand their customer base
Yeah.
beyond just those who are clearly sick.
Mm-hmm.
The whole chemical imbalance theory of depression, which was used to market SSRIs, has actually been quite controversial, with some researchers questioning its validity.
The argument is made that many of these mental health conditions we see in the DSM could be viewed as culture-bound syndromes.
Culture-bound.
Yeah. This doesn't mean there aren't biological factors involved, but it shifts the focus to the idea that the culture itself might be playing a significant role in their development.
Okay.
And individual diagnoses can sometimes reflect broader problems within the society.
Americans, with our emphasis on individualism and a view of ourselves as separate from our history and social context, might be particularly susceptible to this.
Yeah.
Especially given the strong focus on biological explanations for mental illness.
It's interesting to see parallels between eating disorders and other kinds of excessive consumer behaviors.
Such as?
Like the connection between buying and returning lots of clothes and bulimia, or the similarity between huge shopping hauls and binge eating, that overconsumption of cheap goods, where quantity seems to matter more than quality.
What's really important to recognize is that the big food industry and the big pharmaceutical industry are, in many ways, partners in this consumer-driven culture.
How so?
Both thrive on overconsumption, with the pharmaceutical industry often providing the treatments for the health problems that result from the big food industry's products.
And both are regulated to varying degrees by the FDA.
Right. Both industries also need to constantly develop new products and find new markets to increase their profits, looking towards places like China and India as huge potential areas for growth. Even within the pharmaceutical industry, you see a lot of Me Too drugs, copycat medications that don't necessarily work any better than what's already available.
Conflicts of interest in research are a significant concern here,
Yeah.
with studies funded by industry often showing results that benefit the funder. There can also be issues with how studies are reported and a lack of transparency about funding sources.
There's even been a trend of research moving away from universities to private corporate entities, which have less public accountability.
Ultimately, overeating creates a whole range of new markets,
Like what?
from increased healthcare costs to a huge demand for diets, weight loss products, and various weight loss services. Even the food industry itself profits from these healthy brands and their weight loss subsidiaries. And the initial, often temporary, water weight loss that people experience on fad diets can reinforce this whole cycle.
There's a real contrast between downstream solutions that focus on treating the consequences of overeating.
Which benefits big pharma.
Right, and upstream solutions like public health measures that aim to prevent overeating in the first place, which might actually reduce overall consumption.
This brings us to the role of the FDA. Are they really protecting us when it comes to food and drugs?
The big question. While some criticize them for being too lenient or even influenced by industry, they also operate within the laws set by Congress and face legal challenges when they try to implement stricter regulations.
The FDA's authority has grown since the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, but there have also been moves towards deregulation at times, particularly with the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994.
A major point of potential conflict is that the FDA actually receives a significant portion of its funding from the very drug companies it's supposed to regulate.
Through user fees.
Yeah, through user fees. This raises questions about whether they can truly be impartial.
Even things like nutrition claims on food packaging can have unintended consequences,
Like the health halo.
sometimes leading to what's called the health halo effect, where people end up overeating foods that have certain healthy-sounding labels.
The term natural is a good example, as it has very limited regulation by the FDA, leading to a lot of confusion among consumers.
Even the proposal to include added sugars on nutrition labels faced a lot of pushback from some parts of the food industry.
The lack of clear and strong labeling regulations has also led to an increase in lawsuits from consumers over deceptive food marketing.
Right. Groups like the Center for Science and the Public Interest often step in to try and hold companies accountable when government agencies aren't as active.
And when you look at the industry's stance on self-regulation, you see examples like Steven Sanger, the former CEO of General Mills,
Yeah.
saying that they prioritize taste and what consumers want over necessarily making foods healthier.
There's an ongoing debate about whether the FDA has been captured by the industries it's supposed to regulate.
Meaning it acts in their interest.
Right, meaning it's acting more in their interest than in the public's, or if it simply lacks the necessary resources and authority to effectively compete with the very powerful food and beverage sector.
Even something as seemingly simple as the design of food packaging has a huge impact on sales. And the FDA struggles to keep up with the sophisticated marketing techniques used by industry.
We've come back to those initial understandings of consumerism, haven't we?
Yeah, we have.
Seeing how it functions as both a set of moral beliefs that guide our individual choices and a political ideology that shapes our society's values around spending and economic growth.
Both of which heavily influence our relationship with food.
Our sources even offer some practical ideas for trying to limit our own consumption.
Oh, yeah? Like what?
Like Allison deciding to cut back on her frequent trips to large, tempting grocery stores and thinking about using online grocery delivery instead.
Ultimately, the argument here is that relying on individual willpower alone to counter these massive cultural and economic forces isn't enough. No. There needs to be increased government regulation to protect consumers. This ties into this idea of oikonomia, which is about the moral and financial responsibility of both individuals and governments to ensure accountability and transparency.
Okay.
And our sources extend this to include nutritional accountability as well.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've seen just how incredibly complex the issue of overeating really is.
It really is.
It's not just about personal choices, it's deeply woven into our psychology, the way our economy functions, and the pervasive culture of consumerism we all live in.
And it's clear that the food and pharmaceutical industries play significant roles in keeping the cycle going.
And for you, our listener, we really hope this has given you some of those aha moments.
Yeah.
A new way of looking at your own habits and the broader societal factors that influence them.
And that leads to a really important question for you to consider. Given all these powerful forces at play, what do you think is the most effective way to create a healthier relationship with consumption?
Right. Is it through individual changes we make, through changes in how industries operate, or through government policies and regulations?
It's definitely something worth thinking about. We encourage you to continue exploring these ideas and to really reflect on all the ways, both big and small, that consumer culture shapes your own desires and behaviors.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.